name is Josiah Whitaker, and for my refutation speech is in response to Javier's major claim on why native advertising is dangerous to consumers of published media. Now to start off, the advocate's proposition as a whole is not really an argument, as there is only one side to take in it, and the first indication of this is that the claim starts off with the word why. By saying why, it infers to the audience that they are about to listen to something that is informative in nature and not a controversial claim. This immediately turns it into an informative speech rather than a claim of fact speech. So in the earlier weeks of class, we learned about Broderick's model of argument. According to this model, an argument needs to be 1, problematic, 2, to have a perception or choice associated with it, and 3, that it has to have certain characteristics, of which there are 6, such as an inferential leap, a rationale for the leap, and that there are 2 or more choices associated with it. So bearing that in mind, his major claim stating that native advertising is dangerous to consumers is not really problematic, and it lacks controversy because from a consumer standpoint, no one is arguing anything differently. The 3 secondary claims that the advocate uses are 1, native advertising is difficult to identify, 2, publishers are monetarily motivated to continue and expand native advertising, and 3, that large industry participation while focusing on the pharmaceutical industries. Now, the first secondary claim is that native advertising is difficult to identify. This claim has an issue since it doesn't have 2 or more choices associated with it. OTAlliance.org, which is the Online Trust Alliance, is a nonprofit organization with the mission to enhance online trust among consumers. They did an analysis of native advertisements on the top 100 websites. They stated of the 100 sites that OTA audited, 69% had 1 or more native ad on their respective homepage. Of the native ads observed, 9% earned what OTA deemed top trust scores, meeting or exceeding clear transparency requirements. 20% of the native ads were classified as need of improvement, while 71% of the ads received failing grades. So with looking at that research, as well as a study done by Grady College of Journalism and Mass Communication that found fewer than 8% of its research participants couldn't tell the difference between paid and editorial content. With that in mind, from a consumer's point of view, no credible source on the subject of native advertising is claiming that it isn't difficult to identify. Now, to the secondary claim, which is publishers are monetarily motivated to continue and expand native advertising, the advocate mentioned how native advertising had accounted for $4.7 billion in 2013 in ad spending, and how it will continue to expand to $53 billion in 2020. This, along with stating how much major publishing sources such as Times and the National Geographic charge companies to advertise on their website, doesn't really give any realistic explanation that can be used to strengthen the major claim, as it is more of a statement of fact than of anything. In such, it breaks the second characteristic in Brock-Reed's model, which is having a rationale for the leap, since companies spending more and more money on advertising can in no way be connected to increased risk for consumers, since the advocate failed to give any examples of how it could negatively affect them. Now, for the third secondary claim, which talks about large industry participation with mainly focusing on pharmaceutical companies, this is the first time the advocate gave any example of how native advertising can specifically affect a consumer by bringing up an article by pharmaexec.com. This article posted findings which stated that nearly half of patients felt better about taking medication or procedures after reading about fellow patients online. This example, however, has a big issue with it, because regardless of any misinformation about medicine or procedure that a person might read about online and then in turn want to take, they still have to go through certain procedures and checks and balances, such as going to see a licensed physician or doctor to even get a prescription to even take the medicine in the first place. So the doctor would have to clear them if it would even be necessary for them in the first place. So conclusion, while the information that the advocate stated was accurate, reliable, and easy to agree with, that in itself does not make it a claim of argument. And even if it were, the way it is structured as a chain of argument, or a chain argument with all of it leading up to the one example about patients reading online about medications, isn't a very compelling example since it can easily be refuted. Which is why the advocate's claim of fact speech is actually more of an informative speech. Thank you.
All right, it's interesting that we have this in contrast to the last speech, because in the last speech, where the speaker was presenting evidence that supports and bolsters the advocate's position, your argument is a little bit different. Your argument is because these things are true, there isn't really a dispute, and so we don't have an argument. So the underlying purpose of the discussion is made irrelevant. And I think that's a good contrast to the last speech we had, where both people are in essence saying there's good information that leads to the conclusion that the advocate is talking about, but your position is that that means that there's not really an argument here, that it's really an informative presentation. You take the premise being expressed from the very beginning as a why statement, and you suggest that that in fact implies that it's an informative statement. That's a reasonable press to make. You do remind us about, you do want to get the name right, the Brock-Reedy model that identifies what the criteria of an argument are, and you try to show violations in a couple of the points. I'm not sure that the violations are always as clearly explained as they need to be on the secondary points. Like on your first point, when you present the information with all the percentages about from the the online group that does this evaluation of the transparency of the advertising that's being presented there. 69% are using it to some degree. Okay, so there's probably not a dispute about that. 71%, they're failing grades. Then that seems to suggest that there's overwhelming information here that this, in fact, is not very clear to people. It's difficult for them to pick out, and that's problematic. Or that means that it's not problematic because that's what the advocate says, and that's what the truth is, that there's not really any dispute about that. So in essence, you're kind of making the argument that there isn't a contrary position on this issue, and I think that that needs to be explained a little bit more. The second point, you kind of said that it doesn't suggest that there's a rationale for making the inference, and I'm not sure that that's the point that applies here. I think there's an argument that says that we're not really making much of an inference here, that you can see a trend, that there's not a dispute, that there's going to be increased spending on these issues, that the question, if there is any dispute on the subject, it might be about whether or not this is effective. But that really doesn't become a point for the advocate's argument. They are merely presenting an argument that says that there's going to be more spending on this. And again, it's not that there's no rationale, it's that there's no inference here. You're not doing anything that goes beyond that which is directly observable. This is a trend that's going on, and the companies themselves seem to be willing to acknowledge that they're going to spend more money on this. So it's not much of a prediction. Maybe there'll be a variation in how much you spend, but that's not really where the controversy is on this particular point. The third point, I think this one is a place where you do have something that conflicts a little bit more specifically with the advocate's position, suggesting that even if the advertising is in conflict and there is dispute, the truth of the matter is that there's an intervening factor here that mitigates any of this potential harm, and that is the doctor-patient relationship. That's mostly assumed. I think it's generally true. I think you could put some evidence in there that suggests this. There's probably some research that points out that doctors might have preferences for particular kinds of medications that they would direct their patients to. Or, for instance, there's another group that's involved in this process that gets left out of this. That's the insurance company, what your insurance company is willing to pay. As I've discovered on numerous occasions, insurance companies are often unwilling to pay for something just because you saw it advertised on TV and you want to have access to it. The insurance company says, no, you don't qualify for that, you don't need that, you don't get that. And doctors sometimes have to fight the insurance companies to get their patients medications like that, which seems to kind of mitigate the importance of this advertising. And I think that's probably a place where you could have developed the argument a little bit more. I think you've got a good premise there. I think it could be developed a little bit more, and that's where there is a little bit of conflict on the issue. I like the explanation that you had. Like I said, I'm not sure on the second point that you've got the right challenge on rationale, but the first point I thought you explained yourself reasonably well. Okay, thank you.